Good afternoon, good morning, colleagues. Let me say, it is a great privilege and a pleasure for me to be part of the conversations here today. But I must wonder aloud whether this is not a setup by Dr. Makua. I don't know how you bring a research professor to come and talk about issues of teaching and learning unless you really are setting him up for slaughter. But I'll take up the challenge. Thank you very much for the invitation. My specific areas of work are in science and mathematics education. And so I'm going to apologize up front because many of my examples and work that I will draw from will come from those areas. And so for those who may have a phobia or may not like those, please forgive me up front, but I hope we will not go into any very deep discussions, but we'll have engaging conversations that I want to believe you will be able to relate to. But just to prepare you for that kind of engagement around mathematics, for example, I thought I'll begin by asking you questions because I'd like to see if we can engage. Here's a problem that I want you to help me with. If it took 8 men 10 hours to build a wall, how long would it take 4 men to build it? Anyone? Or you don't want to raise your hands? Wrong. 5. Wrong. It will take them no time at all because the wall is already built. Okay, try another one. How can a man go for 8 days without sleep? Yeah? Try that one. Yes? Yes. No problem. He'll sleep at night. So he can go for 8 days. Okay, I think you're now ready for the discussion. I heard that when people heard that Loiso was coming, they thought Loiso Gola was the one who was coming. So I thought I might try my hand at that. Okay, I want to engage with you colleagues about the issue that's on the table, professionalizing teaching and learning in higher education, and specifically looking at the role of professional development, the role of research and professional development. Obviously, I cannot run away from research. That's what I do every day, but I always want my research to be meaningful and linked to my teaching. And so I'm going to engage with that as well. Let's see. Okay. 4 issues I'd like to raise with you, just in case I don't make sense. You will know what it is that I was trying to address with you. 1, I'd like to talk about some of the imperatives for improving teaching and learning, learning, and assessment in education. What are some of the driving forces that make us think very deeply, challenge us to think very deeply about the need to improve teaching, learning, and assessment. And of course, much of the conversation that we had earlier has already touched on these issues, so we will begin to refer to them for emphasis. But also, I'd then like to draw on the construct of pedagogical content knowledge, which is a construct that we use in the research that we work on with teachers. Part of, or the biggest part of my work is around preparing teachers who go to schools to teach mathematics and science. And we have a similar challenge to assist the teachers to take the knowledge that they have from their courses at university when they leave and translate it into into a meaningful package that they can use to teach students at high school. Then I'd like to explore with you some of the research in mathematics education, the research on mathematical knowledge for teaching. And again, it's a research agenda. It's a relatively recent research agenda, just about 10 years old, or from 2000 onwards, maybe 10, 15 years old, where many researchers in mathematics education have begun to think about what do you need to teach mathematics and to teach it well to students. And I suspect these are the kinds of questions that we want to ask ourselves about our discipline. If I'm a lawyer or in legal studies, what do I need to teach law well to students? What do I need to teach mechanical engineering well to students? What do I need to teach human resource development well to students? And I want to use this as a framework that we can begin to think about. Obviously, there'll be differences based on the disciplines from which you come, but I think I want to share this research as a way for us to begin to think about how we can actually think deeply about our own teaching in our disciplines. Then I'll make concluding remarks about the need for and the role of professional development and the scholarship of teaching and learning in professionalizing teaching and learning in higher education. Okay, some brief background about my own work and where I'm coming from. The work that I do essentially with teachers, and that's the work I was presenting at one of the conferences in Johannesburg where we met Dr. Maku, is really designed around professionalizing teaching, using professional development to professionalize teaching. And our key argument and starting point is that teachers need to take charge of their own work. And it is a point that I want to raise with you as well, that we need to take charge of what we do as university teachers. The challenge or the major problem is if we don't take charge of what it is that we do, we open the room, we give the scope to others to actually tell us what we need to do. And for me, that's a critical issue around professionalizing teaching, whether it is in secondary education or higher education. It is about ownership and control. It is us who do the work, and to the extent that we can control the work that we do and avoid others imposing on us in the way that we need to do the work. But for us to be able to do that, to take charge of what we do, we need to professionalize what it is that we do. It is not easy for anyone from outside the medical profession to go and tell a doctor, for example, how they need to treat patients, what it is that they need, how do you diagnose cancer, how do you do this. It's not easy to do that. And simply because it is a protected territory. It's something you do because you have the knowledge of what happens inside. However, with teaching, it's a very difficult and challenging area where many people with very little expertise and knowledge are always willing to volunteer a comment on how it should be done. And my argument is you can only prevent that having other people with almost no knowledge at all of a field telling you how you should actually do it by actually taking charge of the field. You take charge of a field by being experts in your own field, so that anybody who comes in and wants to make a contribution feels out of place immediately if they don't have the expertise. Okay, so that's sort of the bottom line for me. Okay, and that's the background of the work I do, and that's how I'm approaching this conversation with you today. It's very rare for me, it's not common for me to get invited, as I mentioned, to come and talk about issues of teaching and learning. Most of the time people say, oh, you're a research professor, come and talk about research. So as I say, I mean, I wasn't sure whether this is set up or not, but the invitation is normal in one way. It is normal in the sense that I always talk about research on teaching. And so I will talk about research on teaching, and so that's normal. It is abnormal, as I said, because, or it is strange in the sense that it focuses a lot more on teaching than previous other presentations would have done. Okay, what are the imperatives, or some of the imperatives for us to think seriously about the need to improve teaching and learning? Financial imperative, obviously, and this was mentioned earlier in the earlier presentation, that universities actually get part of their funding based on the number of students that are successful. And this is very important to think about. Part of what it does is that it discourages professional students who stay in the system forever. They stay in there, they become professional students. They have no interest of getting out and getting out with a degree. But also it discourages professors who are known and have a reputation within institutions for failing students. When we went to university for the first time, I mean, a professor would get in and there would be a big class of this, and he says, look to your left, look to your right. The people sitting on your left and your right will not be there next year in the second year level. You know, before he even begins, or it was often he begins the class, and they would already have a sense that, and of course, facilities were also constructed with that logic in mind. I mean, first year laboratories, take 100, second year laboratories take 20, third year laboratories take 10, that was a construction in mind. So there was that thinking. And so part of the financial imperatives and the government subsidy is actually to discourage people from doing that. At my university, you actually get to account when students fail. You actually called upon to indicate, write a memo, indicate what happened in this particular case. And of course, you do the same when they pass too much. You also account. So you account whichever way. But the other thing that happens at my university is that they have a concept that they try to reduce free riders in the system. So they've hired a couple of chartered accountants who have developed a formula that looks at all the inputs by each staff member at the university. So they can tell me how much I bring to the university and compare that with the total package that the university gives me. And so over a 3-year period, you're supposed to at least break even, if not help the university make a profit. So you work for the money that they give you. And they factor in these things like the student throughput in your courses. They add the number of publications, the number of doctoral students that graduate. And the formula comes up and says, look, this guy is taking away from the university too much. We're paying this guy too much, and he's not contributing his weight. Of course, you can imagine the kinds of problems and challenges it presents for academics. We vow to challenge this kind of thing, but you know, we have a vice chancellor who is very nice and persistent, and so when he wants to do something, he pursues it so aggressively that sometimes you feel like, okay, let's see what will happen after 3 years. Will I be fired or not? But I guess leave out the political connotations around it. It's a whole idea of trying to build in accountability within the system. But for the university, it's about survival. I mean, if the university doesn't get the money, then the university will not survive. You know, personal imperatives. Teaching is about, at the foundation, is about helping students learn. That's why we walk into class to say, I'm going to teach this class. If you have a sense that students can learn on their own, then you don't need to be in class. But if you think you have a role in assisting them to learn, then you walk to class to go and help them to learn whatever it is that you want to learn in your discipline. Now, if students fail to learn, then it's not only their problem. It means your teaching has also failed. And that's something we don't often confront. We actually think these students, you know, they come from disadvantaged backgrounds. They don't read. They are, you know, students of today. They're not like us. They're not like. But the bottom line is, you also have to bear some responsibility for this. You went in there to help somebody learn. And after you left, nobody learned. And you walk proudly and say, I taught that class. See, so I guess at a personal level, that's a challenge we need to confront as teachers. If we teach, then there's an expectation that we're trying to help somebody learn. Okay, but there's also professional and disciplinary imperatives. For the survival of your discipline, you've got to get students successful in that discipline. Gone are the days when I get excited when people say, I'm the only person. You know, Professor Jita is the only one who's working in this field. I'm going to die tomorrow. Then you can't be excited. You are the only one in this field? No. You'll never, I can tell you, you'll never get a Nobel Prize if you work alone in a field. Nobel Prizes are often awarded based on recommendations by peers who work in similar or related fields and think that your work has pushed the field beyond what they could have done. So if you work alone, you will never be rewarded with a Nobel Prize. So for survival of your discipline and your profession, you got to get students to succeed. You've got to get next generations of students to come through the system. There's a reputational imperative. Often research outputs are used to rank universities. And of course, this has then elevated the status of research within universities. And that's okay, on the one hand, that's fine. But think about the research that you could do that's linked to your teaching. You could actually research your own teaching and publish that and be rewarded for that. And oftentimes you don't need to do too much. Sometimes all you need to do is to get this gentleman to set up the video as you are teaching, and of course get the right permission, ethical clearance, etc., and actually observe what it is that you do and you don't do, and write about that and share with your colleagues. But think about the majority of students in any university. Even if we were to achieve the National Development Goals of 2013, having 25% of our students being at postgraduate level, even if we were to achieve that, 75% of the students would still be undergraduate students. And I'm yet to hear an undergraduate student who says, I'm choosing this class with this professor because he's a good researcher. They couldn't care. No. They choose the class because they think you're going to help them learn. This professor explains very nicely. This professor teaches well. That's what students, undergraduate students, want. They don't know how many articles I publish a year. Then they couldn't be bothered by those. So the bulk of our clientele will be undergraduate students, will always be, at least for the foreseeable future. If we take the National Development Plan seriously, at least until 2030, we'll still have close to 75% of the people that we service being undergraduate students, and who are very interested in how we teach so that they could learn. If you look at recruiters in industry, HR people who come once every year or twice a year to your campus looking for potential graduates to hire, they don't ask, were these students taught research well, to do research well? That's okay. That might be, one of the things you teach, and it's good. But they want to know, were these students taught well, that they can do the job? I want to hire a student from Mangosuthu University of Technology. And the first question is, I want to know, were they taught well? Did they get what they were supposed to get so that they can do the job? And so for many outside stakeholders, while we hold research to rank universities and say this one is the top, this one is the bottom, other clients and stakeholders look at other things. And teaching figures quite a great deal in those considerations. There's an imperative around quality assurance and accreditation of our programs. I had the privilege several years ago when the HEQC system was set up from 2000 onwards to chair panels of that went to different universities to look at the quality of their programs. So program evaluation panels. And sadly also, I also had the experience of sitting in at least panels for 2 universities whose programs were shut down because of quality challenges. But if you look at the criteria that are used by the HEQC for many of the evaluation of quality of the programs, teaching, learning, assessment, and maybe staffing, form the bulk. They carry the program. If you're teaching, your learning, teaching and learning, assessment, and the staffing by the right people who will do a good job of teaching the student, if those are strong, your program is likely to survive. You may have weaknesses here, your library is not as up to date as it needs to be, but we'll just tell the Vice Chancellor to pump in 6-7 million to restock the library. That can be saved. But if your teaching and learning is suspect, your assessment suspect, and the people you hire to teach are not qualified or prepared or assisted to do the job properly, then your program is in trouble. And this is what happened with many of the programs. So this is for us to survive, it's a very sad thing to see a program that you teach in being shut down. Because in other universities that are not as kind, what that means is you also have to leave. Because they can't pay. They pay you to do what? Your program has been shut down. So why do they keep you on welfare at the expense of the university? But of course, you can always try to resuscitate the program and whatever. But it's a big knock when that happens. But we can always anticipate that by working on those issues of teaching, learning, assessment. Okay, I spoke earlier about failed teaching. When you walk in class and you teach and nobody learns, and you suspect you've done your job only to find that you haven't. How can we begin to think about ways to avoid this? And the challenge, of course, today is how do we professionalize teaching and learning in higher education? Okay. Here's a dilemma, and I'll set up the problem that we have. Many of us are recruited for their expertise in their home discipline. You hired because you're a good physicist or you're a good mathematician. In fact, you may even have a PhD in mathematics, and that's why we want you. Or you're a good chemical engineer. We want you to come and teach these chemical engineering students. Good human resource practitioner, have the qualification. So we hire you on the basis of expertise in the discipline. And of course, we never asked you whether you studied teaching, learning, or assessment when we interview you for the position. We don't. We actually say, you have a PhD in mathematics? Oh, wonderful. Where did you get it? Those might be the questions. Okay, tell us, what did you do for your PhD research, etc., etc. But once you are hired, we give you a class. Here's a class of students. Teach them. We didn't ask you about whether you've done teaching or no. We give you, here's a class, teach. And not only do we expect you to teach, but we want you to teach well. You need to do a good job. If you don't, you're in trouble. Of course, we put you on probation so that if you don't do a good job, we can fire you. But we didn't prepare you in advance for that. Okay. Now, the challenge is that you may be an excellent in your field. You may be an excellent engineer. You may be an excellent legal scholar. But that doesn't make you necessarily a good teacher of chemical engineering, a good teacher of mathematics, a good teacher of physics. So that means it places an additional burden, and I'm sorry because I am actually also going to place additional burdens on you on top of what was placed earlier, that we need to do extra. In fact, I'm going to argue that getting your PhD in mathematics is just the beginning. It's not enough. But we need to do more. Okay. Two ingredients, major ingredients for the professionalization of teaching and learning. If you look at how professions, civil engineers, how they protect the profession, one of the things is the body of knowledge. For you to make comments about how the structure is constructed, etc., you need to know the field. You need to know, be grounded in the discipline. So there's no escaping. If you want to teach mathematics, you probably need to have a PhD in mathematics. Or at some point, you will need a PhD in mathematics. You need to be well grounded in your field. Nobody should doubt that you can do it. You need to be strongly grounded in the body of knowledge in your field. But you need to also engage in research-based or research-informed practice. In other words, when you diagnose somebody with cancer, you are informed by the research on that. Somebody who hasn't engaged with that research will not be able to make that diagnosis. Of course, these days people learn medicine from the internet. They make the diagnosis. But that will be faulty. So these are among others, these are the two major ingredients for professionalizing a profession. So if we want to professionalize teaching and learning in higher education, one of the things we need to do is to develop scholarship, a body of knowledge around teaching and learning in higher education. And if we are the people, the practitioners in that field, we are the ones to develop that body of knowledge. Nobody else. If you teach in mathematics, you want to professionalize teaching and learning of mathematics in higher education, you need to produce knowledge around what it means to teach and learn graduate mathematics or calculus at university. Nobody else can do that. You are in a better position to do that. And so part of professionalizing your work is around providing a body of knowledge, doing research and producing scholarship that will anchor what it is that you do. And then you need to use that research to inform what you do when you actually teach students mathematics. So it's no longer a hit or miss, random, but you are informed by what you and your peers have researched to say, you know, to begin to help students understand the basics of calculus, this is how we approach it. And you research and see whether that works or not. And based on that, you can actually inform your practice. The next group of calculus students who come in, you actually use approaches that are anchored in literature. So, scholarship of teaching and learning becomes critical for professionalizing teaching and learning in higher education. But it's not everybody who will engage in the scholarship of teaching and learning in your field. You may still want to find that formula or to test Euler's formula in mathematics, and therefore will not engage in how students learn mathematics or calculus, because you really want to solve that mathematical problem. And that's okay. But we can't all do that. Some of your colleagues have to find out that once you've found that formula, how do we help new students in the field to understand what you did? And that's where they come in with their scholarship of teaching and learning of mathematics. And so, because you will not be engaged in that kind of research possibly, you will want to know what it is that they say so that that informs your teaching. And that's where professional development comes in. And this is where discipline-based professional development becomes useful. And it's not just a general, but it says, how do we teach physics? How do we teach thermodynamics? How do we teach, et cetera, et cetera. And your colleagues will make much of a contribution, including yourself. You may actually try what they say and find it doesn't work in your situation, but something else works. But it's important to then document that and write it up and share it with your colleagues. What I want to do now is to take two research programs where researchers have also thought about the professionalization of teaching, but where researchers have actually asked the question, what will it take for teachers to teach well? And of course, as I said, the context of this work is general education. In other words, secondary and primary education. But I'm just putting it across in case the conceptual tools begin to make sense in higher education or help us think in different ways about the same challenge that we are facing. How do we help lecturers teach better in a higher education context? How do we help physics lecturers to do this? How do we help mathematics or chemical engineering lecturers teach better? So I'm going to share these two research programs. Okay, one is a program that was carried at Stanford University under Lee Schulman and his colleagues. And essentially, they came up with various categories of knowledge that they think are important for teachers, or make up what they call teachers' knowledge base for teaching. In other words, what do you need to know in order to teach a particular subject well? General pedagogical knowledge, you need to know different strategies for teaching, organizing learners to do group work, to do individual work, etc. Those that can be applied in different contexts. But you also need to know your learners and their characteristics. Now, here's Jita, who comes in with his training in biochemistry, he's teaching biochemistry, has no clue about general pedagogical knowledge, doesn't know that you can actually stop the preaching to the students and organize them in groups such that they work in smaller groups instead of standing in the pulpit and reciting a couple of verses from the textbook. The knowledge of the learners, very rarely in higher education do we care where the learners come from. We actually say, these are adults, come, I'm going to teach you thermodynamics, and I start. We don't pay attention to who's in class. What is it that they bring to class? What kinds of insights might be useful for me as I teach thermodynamics? We don't. We often teach the subject and not teach the students, which is a very useful and big difference. Because remember, part of teaching, you're trying to help, as I've indicated earlier, to assist someone to learn. But if you teach the subject, then you don't pay attention to the particular person. You just teach physics. You don't teach students the physics. Knowledge of educational context, of course, because we don't have this kind of information and it doesn't become useful to us, we don't know what is the background of a student. We suspect that high school education is poor in this country, so they come with a deficit. We suspect, it's a suspicion. And of course, when they don't perform well, you know, it proves our suspicion. You know, oh yeah, I thought as much. Those high schools are not doing well, you know. But we haven't actually educated ourselves about the educational context of the different students. Now, to teach without understanding where your students come from is very risky. It's a hit or miss, because you don't have the background. You have nothing to guide you. And I'm sorry, as I said, I'm complicating your task, because I'm now asking you that you need to know your students. That even makes your task even more complicated. But it just makes your work easier if you knew something. If you knew, for example, that they no longer do geometry in high school. So when you come and teach the first year mathematics, don't expect them to know geometry. They don't do it at high school. Why do you then suddenly blanket them as stupid when they didn't have that at high school? It's your responsibility now to say, okay, I know you didn't do geometry, but this is what I want you to know, and so this is where we begin. Without the assumption that, you know, and this, let me share you a story with you that we always find with teachers. When you work with teachers, when you work with high school teachers and you ask them, why are your learners not doing well in mathematics? And this is common in mathematics because most students fail. They tell you, you know, those grade 11 teachers didn't do a good job. They didn't prepare these students. You go to the grade 11 teachers. What's the problem? Those grade 10 teachers didn't do. You go all the way to the grade 3s. What's the problem? No, those grade 2 teachers didn't prepare these learners. You go to the grade 1s. No, you say these children didn't attend kindergarten. You go to kindergarten, you see the parents don't prepare these kids at home. You know, so everybody just, you know, shifts it backwards. But that's part of, we need to understand where are the learners when they come to us, and what would be the best approach for me given this context. And it doesn't mean you teach what was supposed to have been taught, but it just informs your teaching so that you don't make faulty assumptions about your students. Okay, so to teach well, you need content knowledge, obviously, and as we said, many of us will have that because we come with that expertise. We are normally hired on the basis of the expertise in our field. But the major innovation in Schulman and his team was the notion of pedagogical content knowledge. And this was a concept that they used to describe this innovative mix between content and pedagogical knowledge. In other words, knowing how to represent the content of your discipline to your learners. So it's not just about you saying, I know this stuff. I have a PhD in physics. But for you to help somebody to learn, you need to understand how to represent that concept for the person to say, oh, I see. You know? So if you get in and just read from your notes, year in and year out, then you will have a problem and you will complain that your students are very poor and they become poorer every year. But guess what you're doing? You're not representing the content in ways that will make them understand what you're trying to do. So that's why I'm saying part of the failed teaching is also your responsibility. Did you represent the concepts in such a way that people can understand them? Or you just took them from the textbook, page 12, and put it on the data projector and read a few lines there and say next. That may not be enough to represent the context in such a way that somebody understands and learns. So, content knowledge refers, to the facts and the concepts in your domain. And as I've said, usually that's not a challenge for many of us in higher education, because many of us come in well-educated, with PhDs. So the facts and the concepts of our discipline are not the problem. The problem is around trying to represent these in such a way that we help other people understand. And that's the concept of pedagogical content knowledge. Now, I said I wanted to refer to this so that you begin to think about your own work in trying to improve your teaching and learning. Think about whether the concept of pedagogical content knowledge would make sense. Do you find ways, different ways, by the way, of representing the facts, the concepts for your students in such a way that you could perhaps assist them to understand the subject better? So, let's make an example of this. Imagine a grade 5 teacher who's teaching decimal fractions. And I chose grade 5 decimal fractions because everyone in this room has been through grade 5. So no one has an unfair advantage. We all been through that and we've passed it, and hopefully we did well in it. If you want to teach decimal fractions, the two things that you need to do. Um, one is, actually, let me see if I have. Okay. One is that you need to have an understanding of place value and positional notation. And that's a content you bring as a teacher. I actually took out a slide here where I was going to test whether you have that or not. Okay, you need to know that place value and positional notation. But if you are going to teach it and teach it well, you need to anticipate what are the challenges the fifth graders will have in understanding decimal fractions. Before you walk into class, you need to anticipate this. And this is the value of the concept of pedagogical content knowledge. You can't walk into class and say, I don't know what they will think about this concept. You need to anticipate. Okay, previous experience suggests that students tend to think this way about this. Research suggests they think this way. So you begin to anticipate. And as you teach, you begin to see whether those are some of the errors that come in during your teaching. For example, fifth graders will often confuse 0.5 and 0.05. And the simple reason they confuse 0.05 and 0.5 is because for them, 5 and 0.5 are the same number. And are they not? Yeah, 5 and 0.5 is the same number. So then, for them, well, that comma means nothing, can be removed. And then you have 0.5 and 0.05 being the same number. But if you haven't thought about this, if you're just the grade 5 teacher who is a content expert, you know that you want to teach them about 0.5 and 0.05. But you haven't figured out that this may be confusing to them when you teach it. You just walk in and teach it. And you get surprised when they fail your test. But I taught them and I spent so much time and energy. But you actually didn't help them learn. Because if you had anticipated some of that, you could have perhaps helped them. So what does this mean? This means it's important for us to understand, for example, some of the common errors our students are likely to make about our disciplines. So that when you walk to class, you have that. But how do you get that information? You need to do research. So we can't escape research. But it's a kind of research that's very useful, that's very nice to do because I'm going to use it in my teaching. So it links the research and the teaching. When we say your research must link to your teaching, these are the kinds of things we are talking about. How do other people represent, how do they deal with that problem where students equate 0.5 and 0.05? How do other people deal with it? You'll probably find that there are other researchers who've encountered this and who've written about how they deal with it. But do that for your discipline. That's how you grow the scholarship of teaching and learning in your discipline. So you make a contribution. And if all of you, if the 30 of you in the discipline at MUT, then all of you make a contribution. You can imagine how strong your teaching will be and how strong your research will be in your discipline. Let's look at the second research program. This one is specific for mathematics, mathematical knowledge for teaching, MKT. And it's led by researchers mostly at the University of Michigan, Deborah Ball. Obviously, and obviously I had to look at this research, given that Deborah Ball was my teacher, so I can't escape it. But what Deborah Ball did, and her colleagues did, was to refine the concept of PCK that was developed by Schulman and colleagues, to actually go deeper and look at mathematics specifically, and say, to teach mathematics well, what do teachers need to know? What kind of knowledge do they need to bring in? And then they come up with this concept of common content knowledge. And common content knowledge is what we talked about, the kind of knowledge that every literate person who's probably gone through high school will have. Or engineers, if we're teaching mathematics, engineers do mathematics as in their basic courses. Physicists will do a couple of those, chemists, health professionals will do a Maths 1 course here, etc. Now, if you take all of those people, they will have what we call common content knowledge. In other words, they will know how to solve a problem that says 35 times 25. They will know how to solve that. And that's common content knowledge. But for a teacher, that knowledge is not enough. It's not enough for you to know what is the answer to this as a teacher. As a teacher, you need to have more than what is the answer to 25 times 35. And here's an example. Take a student who is trying to multiply that, 35 by 25, and you get two students who give you two different representations. In fact, there's another representation by three students. But the question that you're asking, which example below shows a method that could be used to multiply any two whole numbers? And that's not a question for the presentation. It's actually a question I'm asking you. Sorry. I need an answer from you. Which of the examples below show a method that could be used to multiply any two whole numbers? B, both. Yes. The answer is actually both. But you see, as a teacher, you don't only need to know how to multiply 35 by 25. You need to be able to understand various representations of that by students. Because then students present you with different ways of actually doing this. Now, if you only have common content knowledge, you'll know the answer has to be 875. But that's as far as it goes. You will not be able to make a judgment on whether student A is correct, student B is correct, and why. So that's the specialized content knowledge. That ability of you as a teacher to look at students' representations of various concepts that you're trying to teach and make judgments about whether these are correct or not and are useful or not and why. Remember, if these were wrong, if you think B is the correct one, you have to provide feedback to the student on why A is not correct. You don't just put a big tick, or a big cross, wrong, -1, which is what we do. We penalize them, of course, -1, not even 0, But the student has no clue why that is wrong. And you can't intervene because perhaps you also don't have any clue why that is wrong. It's just not in your memo. No? Okay. Here's the point. Okay, so that's an illustration of the common content knowledge, specialized content knowledge. And this is what we need. So in other words, what we're saying is we need much more than what a PhD in your field will know. So when you teach, you need a PhD in your field, but that's not enough. A PhD in your field is going to make you the same as any PhD who's working in industry. But you're not working in industry. You are teaching. So you need a little more than that. You need to think a little more than the person who uses this in industry. You need to be able to figure out how do you help others learn what you know. The person who graduated with you in the same class who's working somewhere with the same qualification doesn't have that burden. You have an additional burden as a teacher. And to the extent that you can do that, then you become effective as a teacher. So in other words, the challenge at this point then is that we need to be experts in our field. That's a starting point. But we need to go beyond that and know how to help others understand our own fields. So there are two critical things then that I'm suggesting we need to think about as we try to help ourselves and our colleagues teach better. We need to research our own practices. We need to understand how others learn and how we teach so that we become very deliberate about what we're doing. We also need professional development that's related to what we do. We cannot escape. I cannot just walk into class and hope that I'll be able to assess students properly without any support in terms of knowledge. I need professional development in that field. And this may vary. I mean, I'm not saying you should be experts on teaching and learning, but you should know enough for you to be able to do a good job in your class. Concluding remarks, it's not enough to be just an expert in your field. Such expertise by itself is only useful outside of the academic. Teaching requires you to do much more. To teach well requires that we acquire specialized knowledge for teaching. Such knowledge may include specialized content knowledge or PCK in your own field. At least two ways of helping us equip ourselves is by engaging in research, scholarship of teaching and learning, and engaging in professional development. In closing, a PhD is not enough. It is what you need. It is a minimum condition. But if you want to be a good teacher and you want to ensure that your students are successful, then you definitely are challenged to do more. Thank you.